I got interested in institutions quite a long time ago, and I'd been thinking about them a lot. And the reason I was interested in them, apart from the fact that we're in them all the time and they cause us so much trouble, is that it seemed to me that the collectivities that we live in now, us, are the organizations that we live in, and that our myths are in them. And that maybe one way to think in sort of contemporary terms about something called the collective unconscious, whatever that was to actually look at the collectivities that we're actually in and see if there's any way of thinking about them or looking at them or understanding them with some of Jung's ideas in mind, but not necessarily in exactly the same way he did. So that was what prompted me to start doing some study and research about an institution. And one of the things that I got interested in was how people use stories in talking about the institutions they're in and what happens in them, and how those stories reflect the boundaries and the shape and the nature and the concerns of institutions and so on. So it got to be research that happened in relation to documents and texts, and drew on a lot of social theory, and in particular on contemporary theories about language. And I was feeling a terrible tension because I was in another department and in another area, and everybody there thought that things that happen in psychology, and particularly in this funny analysis business, really were a bit sort of beyond the pale, and so you got all of that stuff going on. So I was trying to keep a very low profile and just see what I could find out and learn about there. And so that was what I was doing. And as I started to do the actual work of working on texts, the people who were working with me started to realize that I could do some things with those texts very quickly that maybe they hadn't seen before, and there was a lot of openness to that, and that was nice. But I began to realize that one of the things that I could do was use what I already knew how to do from doing analytic work. So I started to feel that maybe the differences weren't so big as they felt like they were at first, and the tension started to feel less. And so on, and working through, a lot of studies and a lot of looking very closely at text. Your mind goes off in different directions and different things happen and you think about different things. And at one point I suddenly made this connection, and I realized that one of the struggles we have is that Jung actually worked in a very different, with a very different intellectual tradition than some of the intellectual tradition which we are specially brought up in Anglo-American education and systems of ideas, and that we didn't know a lot about them as a group and as a society and so on. The background to some of the Jungian thought, that was one thing I found. And the other thing I found was that particular line of thinking had actually grown and developed in all sorts of directions since Jung's time, and produced a huge variety of different kinds of studies, basically, and that they all seem to be less different than one might have thought when you started really getting closer to them and getting into them. So I wrote some of this, and offered to somebody who's actually a sociologist but is very interested in Jung. And because I thought, well, maybe I'm just making this up. And he agreed with me that, you know, that there was really something quite strong there, and that he'd been thinking about it for a long time, but he didn't know how to bridge the gap. And I said, well, neither do I. So when I was asked to think about a paper for this year, I thought, well, maybe all of this might have something to do with interpretation, or have some bearing on interpretation. And the actual sort of writing of this paper happened, and this is what I find, that ideas come just the same way that they do in sessions. Things sort of, you know, come in, and then you get an idea and it takes you there, and then you sort of pull back and you put some more things together, and that the process, again, felt very familiar. And I started to think that, and this is the hypothesis which I'm trying to sort of raise for people to think about and discuss, is that maybe what we need to do is to think about what interpretation is and how it's done. Not the content, and not the sort of truths or not truths of them, but just how do we do it? And if we actually thought about and studied very closely how we actually do it, I think we'd get near to some of the problems that people are having in other disciplines about trying to understand how they come to understand things about other groups of people, cultures, and so on, i.e. the problems for anthropologists, the problems of all the kind of social inquiries have a lot in common. And there's good interpretation and bad interpretation, and it goes on everywhere. And you can see similar kinds of problems in other kinds of disciplines. So I think that thinking about how people do interpretation and what it is might be an interesting study for us. And that's my proposition. So I think that's all I need to say, perhaps.
Mm. Can you say what institution you worked in, or is it too private?
Is it private? No. Well, mainly I've been at Goldsmiths, which is part of the University of London. Oh, what? You mean what institution I did my research in?
Well, you mentioned an institution that had stories attached to it.
Oh, yes. No, I wouldn't say what institution it was, no. Same issues of confidentiality apply.
Giving us the most terrific challenge to say how do we do it without mentioning content. And I mean, I think it's a very valuable one, but I can see where we all feel help.
Yes.
How can we
start to think about that?
And one of the things that I felt was very helpful in your paper was, are we interpretations, is it scientific to do with truth, or is it to search for meaning, hermeneutic? And that feeling, well, to me it certainly isn't to do with truth, it's to do with meaning. But how one does it is another dimension, in a way, to what one's used to thinking of, so it's quite a difficult one.
And it may be, I think that one of the things that partly I've been taught and partly I've come to see the value of is that asking how questions before you ask why questions can often be quite a useful way of tackling a problem. So that would be one answer to you. I'm not sort of trying to pull up the flag for any particular method. There are methods. And so I'm reluctant to say, well, I think this, because I think then we just start the next round of, and my way is better than your way, rather than grasping the nettle, which is, how do we know what way it is in the first place?
But straight away we're stuck with this business, in particular to therapy and analysis, which is this confusion between interpretation as understanding and interpretation as something we say. And I'm not, when you say how do we do it, I'm not quite sure about that, about which you're thinking about, how we come to understand things, or a matter of discussing them with patients.
Well, I think maybe what I'm suggesting is we need to step one step back from that question before we can get to that question. And that the question that maybe needs to be asked is, how do interpretations relate to understanding? And maybe that means not necessarily analytic interpretations, but they're one kind. But they're one kind of lots of kinds. And maybe there are ways of thinking about how interpretations are achieved that have general properties.
Can you give an example of what you've got in your mind?
A concrete example.
Well, yes, more concrete than what you've given,
Right.
what
Well,
you've said.
I mean, I feel like I want to help the discussion, but I don't want to end up giving an hour-and-a-half lecture either.
Well, I don't want you to either. But
I think the net's been spread so wide that we need a little help to get into
To get hold of it.
Yes.
Well, I mean, I did put in the little bit from Ulysses, which is quite dense.
Very dense.
Everybody's
I
got
think
it.
if you give a concrete example or an example, people will batten onto that and then pick it to pieces, and we'll lose sight of the general drift of your
Well, that's what I'm worried
paper,
about.
really.
Mm.
I don't know whether it's doing that to a certain extent if I ask you what you mean by these things are researchable. I mean, I know that it's maybe one step further than you intended to go in writing the paper to etch out a research program, but you must, I know you have interest in instituting research programs, and I couldn't think of research programs which don't beg a lot of questions and make a lot of assumptions or hypotheses or scientific suppositions which you thereupon go ahead and try to test. I couldn't think of any research program, for example, which didn't decide to have a lot of particular reagents to, I mean, if you were taping interviews, for example, and analytic interviews involving interpretations and so on, who you got to listen to it, and how you got people to select what they wanted to find out from the interviews. And I mean, maybe you could imagine one interview from Freudian school, one interview from different schools, all listening to the tape and so on, and giving their idea of what happened during that interview. You could also ask people from working class area in Manchester to listen to it, or people from Japan or people from different religions to listen to it and say what they thought had been going on in that interview. I mean, the research sort of goes in a sort of, I mean, instead of, I mean, people I had to supervise in doing a PhD with projects and that sort of thing, it was always difficult to get them to narrow it down enough to make a sort of practical program. And I feel that your program is so expansive and so wide that in narrowing it down to something practical, you're going to have to beg a lot of questions of the type that you're saying let's not do, if you see what I mean.
Well, I mean, I think one of the things I don't want to do tonight is really to give you a long lecture about 7 different kinds of research methodologies,
Yes.
but just to say there are 7 or 10 or 12
Yeah.
that are around. I only know a little bit about one of them, but I know vaguely about some other ones that are around. And that one of the issues is that a lot of the research that does get done in this field derives from the academic psychology models, which do tend to have much more of the scientific hypothesis and deductive reasoning kind of model. There are lots of newer, different kinds of quite developed research methodologies, which are of what you'd call inductive, which means that you have a basic kind of analytic technique which you apply to raw data, and you generate hypotheses through a process, an evolving process of analysis and reanalysis. And that's a different style of research, and that is the sort of thing that I would be interested in seeing more of, because we do see a lot of the academic psychology model research going on. There's not plenty of it, not enough of it, but there is that going on. There are other ways of tackling these problems, which are much more inductive, synthetic kinds of methods. 1, to reply. And 2, I'm making this as broad as possible, not to confuse people, but just to say that, you know, I'm not sort of trying to say there's a holy grail if we can follow it, because there isn't one. And that I think that we have to actually look outside our own practices and bring some new ones in. But the other thing I've come to realize from doing the work is that we know an awful lot about the practice of interpretation, because that's what we do. And we have a lot to offer as well, if we can find ways of offering it. And I suppose I'm arguing for a cross-disciplinary approach, which I think would be beneficial to us and beneficial to other disciplines. We are specialists in interpretation, that's what we do.
Aren't we different from many other disciplines in that we consciously are having a reverence for the unconscious? And that seems to make us a bit different.
Has anybody got anything to say? I want to spend my evening, spend the whole
Yes, I
time.
was going to ask something rather similar, because the sociologist I met, and obviously nowhere near as I gather you've worked in a sociology department, is that right?
For a couple of years I've been attached to a sociology department, yeah.
You've been attached to
I've been attached to a sociology department,
doing some kind of research.
yeah.
but taking into account the unconscious, as Avro asked.
Well, I went there, and I sort of put aside all my all of that kind of ideas. I went on working with them over here and doing my work, and I did this other work
Can you be
and tried to
precise
see
about
how they
what
could
doing
come
your-
together.
Can you be more precise about what doing your work was?
Where? You mean at
Well, these two things that you demonstrated with your hands.
yes. On the one hand, I'm doing my practice and my supervising, my analysing and my supervising and my teaching, bits of teaching I'm doing that within the field of analytical psychology, and carrying on with my usual set of my training and my usual set of assumptions. And then I sort of for a time, and found it really hard, split this other part of me off and started to learn something new from scratch, really. And I was trying to see what I could find out there that might actually help me to develop some thoughts about how. And I have to say that one of the things I've come to feel is that I'm not happy with the idea of the unconscious as a noun. As a noun. As a noun.
Well, we could say the unconscious layers of the psyche, or unconscious actions, or unconscious thoughts, or unconscious fantasies.
Unconscious, and Jung says this. Unconsciousness is a property of things. And that's really important. You see, Jung was on to lots and lots of important things. And that's what I've discovered, that Jung was on to lots of really important things which have got buried because of the domination of the strand of analytic thought, which is psychoanalysis, is the most important example, which has its origins in this other kind of thinking, which is called correspondence kind of thinking, that nouns relate to things which exist inside people, and that there is this entity called an unconscious inside people that has an existence. But Jung never said that, actually. He sometimes got in a muddle, but he was trying to get to this other thing, which is the unconscious. The collective is a process that people are embedded in. And that's the importance of, say, this quote about the subjective. I mean, if you, where is it? The subjective interpretation.
Page 13.
Page 13. I thought these were terribly important. Well, there's this very important quote. The semiotic interpretation becomes meaningless when it is applied exclusively and schematically, when, in short, it ignores the real, embodied nature of the symbol and debases it into a mere sign. And I think that, that is the sort of thinking and talking that Jung was doing when he was trying to say that we can't have interpretations, that we can't have words and interpretation words being linked to some thought or entity in people's unconscious. And that the symbolic process, which happens in dialogue and in the interpretive process, is embodied in the interaction, and that meaning comes out of that, not out of some sort of link with something some entity. And this is a sort of fundamental philosophical difference.
But just as Jung and you, I believe, talk about the difference between the internal image of a person and that person, I think one has to have the same attitude towards meaning, the idea of meaning, or the concept of meaning, or the experience of meaning. I mean, after all, meaning is a feeling as much as, I mean, you can regard it as a feeling of meaning or a feeling of meaninglessness, or a conjunctio or a destruction of a conjunctio, if you like. And I think that, I mean, to talk about truth and about meaning as though they're nouns is making the same sort of mistake. I mean, you can talk about a feeling of truth, or you can talk about a feeling of meaning, just as Winnicott talked about a feeling of real, or a feeling of unreal, and so on. I think one attitude towards meaning is to take a psychological approach to it, or get one step outside the idea of absolute meaning, or of meaning being something which is primary in relationship. I think that you're doing the same thing when you talk about an interactional space between people who are trying to communicate, or who are communicating with each other, or having language and communication going on between them. You're talking about that space as though it's one space between the two people. But I mean, each person has or has not a space. And if those two people are thinking that there is one space between them, that's the kind of delusion or illusion or something that we have to deal with in analysis. I mean, one person thinking, that there's a cultural playing sort of Winnicottian space going on, and the other person not. The other person behaving as though he's completely without space. I mean, he's got no symbolic potentialities at all.
Well, I think the thing that I'm interested in is finding out how that person does that.
Which person?
The person that, say, doesn't feel that they've got any space and acts as though there's no space, and puts the therapist or analyst in the position where there's no space.
Yeah.
How do they do it?
Yeah.
And I think I begin to see a way of having a look at that.
Right. Well, that's very important.
And that it's a little bit sort of, it's not very deep. I mean, in the sense that, I might not. I'm saying that we might actually see how that's done in quite an empirical sort of way, and I think there are ways to do it. That's one thing.
You wouldn't stick your neck out and say how, then?
Well, I mean, I will, but I just feel like I don't want to be in the position of giving a lecture. For an hour and a half.
No, share your ideas a bit. We'll try not to persecute you.
There are quite, for example, just in looking at the details of interaction, there's a whole body of research around which is roughly called conversation analysis, and there's quite a few different sort of applications and different things that are being done with that. And what people are doing is they're looking cross-culturally as well at how people construct conversations and how they achieve. The idea is instead of taking it for granted that we sort of acquire language and then we know how meaning works, how does it happen that as I speak, which is quite fast in fact, I put a bunch of words together and you were able not only to understand what I've said, but possibly to complete my sentence for me. And that there's a very complicated process that goes on there, and that it's a collaborative process, and that there are very common and familiar methods that are used, and they're even used across cultures, that have not so much to do with content as with how the thing is structured and put together. And the tradition of that is sort of ordinary language, and the sort of each field, of course, has its own mythology, and the mythology there is that all this comes off beautifully, easily, and wonderful, and everybody can do it. Well, what we know is that everybody can't do it, and lots of people do it in a way which makes for very, very disrupted, dysfunctional interaction. So I think that, for example, is one way of tackling it. There are other, but I mean, I don't want, like I say, I don't want to pull up a flag, because there's other ways of treating documents, and that's why I just put this in, just to sort of, just to say that there's just lots of ways of approaching this problem. Lots of ways of approaching this problem.
But might the way that the problem is approached have to do with the aim that you have in mind? Because I wonder whether perhaps the people who are doing conversational analysis think that everybody can do it because their aim is to show how ordinary conversation works. Now, we have a very different aim, which is something to do with understanding, I mean, say very broadly included, how people come to be in emotional distress. And then the question that I would ask is, I mean, not ask you particularly, but just sort of ask generally, is, what is the means whereby we can best understand that? And it seems to me that we actually are using theories which help us to do that. And that that perhaps the models that we use are related to the aim. They also are related to the practice, which is why there's this common thing that that is often held against psychoanalysis, that people say that from Freud onwards that you have to have been in analysis to understand what it means, and we all know that that's true because you cannot communicate the experience of analysis. It's extremely difficult to communicate that experience outside it. So if you like, it has a particular language and it generates a particular language, and that language is embodied in its theories. So in a way, the problem perhaps that I have with what you're suggesting is that it's I'm not sure how this other language that's coming from another discipline with other aims, I mean, yes, I can see how there are connections that might be interesting, but I'm not quite sure how much that can be imported.
Well, I've got two propositions. I don't want to get hooked on one thing, but I mean, first of all, I think that seeing how when you're working, if you do group work, you tend and you get much more aware of this because you see it happening in groups, the way people control what happens in the group with how they change the subject and what they do with words and so on. So I think maybe as a group worker you get much more tuned into that kind of thing going on, and then you start to see it in individual interactions more. So I mean, I think on a very basic empirical level that it's possible to raise awareness of how people control other people with words, and how people control what's going on in between two people with words. And my proposition is that that is the means by which we react to people and have feelings. That our feelings don't happen in a vacuum. They happen because we're social beings, and they happen in relation to other people. They also happen, as we know, in relation to people that we think about in our minds. But they happen in relation to people. They don't happen in and of themselves. And what we have is the case of autism to show us that, when people fail to communicate properly, they fail to develop affect, basically. So, I think that case is quite clear. The second thing that I think is important about that is that it's a way of tackling the big criticism of psychotherapy, which is, you've got this plethora of theories, and as far as we can tell, we've done all these outcome studies, and we can't see any difference between any of the different theories. They all seem to have more or less the same outcomes. Well, this tends to suggest to me, and this seems to me to be fairly basic logic, that, maybe it isn't our theories that make the content of our theories, the exactitude of our theories, that actually is what's going on. What's actually going on is that we're using our theories to make sense of the world. And what we're doing is helping people to make sense of the world in more complicated sorts of ways, and less stereotyped sort of ways, and less restricted sort of ways. We're not saying you've got to be a different person, or we're actually saying, well, there's different ways of thinking about things. So that's basically what we're saying to our patients most of the time. And what I'm saying is that maybe we could look at how that is achieved, and then we'd get out of this thing of fighting over my theory is better than your theory, and we'd actually have a joint concern, which is, how do we use these theories, and how do they make any difference? And, in what we actually, what we do with words, which is what we do in this profession. We do things with words in our consulting room.
But it could be argued, you are saying your theory is better than Warren's theory, you see, because you're saying that a conversational analysis, which Warren's...
I don't want to get drawn into this. I'm not going to do it. I just use that example because I know a tiny little bit more about that one than others.
Is a different sort of model from the model that Warren is meeting people, and the rest of us are meeting people, and you are meeting people in your consulting.
My second point is that conversation analysis, I think, has a certain kind of use, and that is, I think you could actually look at how things get fought out in the consulting room. But it's only one. That the whole sort of issue of looking at how theory, that using theory is how we deal with the world. We all use theories. That's what everybody does.
Yeah, well, that's what theories are. That's what I'm saying. That's what theories are for, isn't it?
That's what theories are for.
And so practical is a good theory.
So that there are actually ways of looking at how people are using a particular set of ideas to interpret a particular situation, and what the upshot of that is. And that's at a different level. I mean, there's lots of ways of tackling this problem. There's not just one way of tackling it.
So I wonder if our theories are also like our reagents. They are influenced by our own idiosyncrasies. They are influenced by our own idiosyncrasies. So, like in your quote, and therefore they are personal in that sense. And that might be the sense in which my theory is better than your theory, because my theory is the one that I hold dear, that I feel passionately about, because it's rooted in who I am, and that's therefore, that's the kind of extension of what I'm using to make sense of things. I mean, I agree with all that, with people, and to help people to look at things in a different way. But I think these theories only work if they're rooted in this kind of personal conviction.
That's fair enough. I've no problem with that.
But also means therefore there will always be different theories, and we will always argue about our theories because we are different, and therefore we hold different things dear.
Mhm. We can do that. I have no object. I mean, I think that's what institutions are for.
But our methodologies are different also, aren't they? Because of our aim, in the sense that scientists accuse us of not attempting to falsify our hypotheses following Popper. But we don't, because it would be distressing to our patients if we attempted to falsify our understanding, our hypotheses about why it is there.
That's not the point of research intervention, though. I think it's the next level up, which is, I mean, I think what I'm saying is, and this is not the least bit original, is that, you know, what happens in the therapeutic interaction is, I mean, and this is where Jung was, you know, on it. Was in the relationship and in the sort of communicative symbolic relationship between two persons and the struggle within that. And I think what I'm saying is that it used to be thought up until even the 60s that was some kind of ineffable process, and that was generally around in most disciplines, that was really something ineffable. But I actually think that things have come to a point where there are actual some ways of actually looking at how that works. And it sounds very mundane to take it down to how it works, but I think it would actually help us if we could see a little more of, you know, some of, and this is where you get stuck, because I almost used the word mechanics, and it's really, really hard to get rid of that word mechanics when you're talking about it. But the sort of regularities with which interactions happen.
It begins
to
feel as if one could almost look something up in a book. And I'm just thinking, I have a patient who's highly intelligent and who strings out his talking with enormous long spaces. And I can think and feel all sorts of things about that. And how is your idea, this conversational
I don't want to
research?
get stuck on that, please.
But you're implying that I could refer to that in my mind. I mean, I already have quite a lot of feelings and information about it. And a lot
Well,
of
I
that
don't
comes through
know
my body.
if, I mean, I'd like people to share with me. I listen to how people are controlling the talk, and sometimes I listen to it and I keep working at it very closely. Like whenever somebody gets up and talking about something that made them angry, and then they change the subject, I say, "You seem to have changed the subject." Now that's something I do regularly in my work now. Does anybody else do anything like that? Or see the relevance of it? Well, that's all I'm talking about.
It seems to me that
What are you I'm not quite sure what you're adding, because you're introducing ideas which, if I've understood it correctly, that some of the things you're describing about the way people control each other might have come into Lang's early research about schizophrenic families and language, as for instance.
Yes.
Or it might be contained in some of Jung's ideas about not knowing beforehand and taking an atheoretical approach to your patient and building a new theory with each new patient.
Yeah, it's not quite right, I think, that.
Okay, we'll take up that point then.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, I mean, this is in the area which is at the sort of front of where I'm thinking at the moment, but I think that that we can't actually we can't actually talk to other people without some kind of theory about them. And we had a fight about this already.
Have we?
Yeah, we've had discussions about it, that, sort of, odd little remarks a couple of times. I think that actually the kinds of theories that we have about other people are things that start from very, the minute we open our eyes, actually, and are met by a person who's offering something. And that actually Jung is not really talking about anything if he says not having a theory, because of course we have a theory. We can't be sentient human beings without having some kind of a theory about the world. And I think that, I know Bion says the same sort of
Fordham
thing.
tried to develop this in a recent paper, didn't he, when he tried to describe how it was something that you had to learn. Because when you were listening, particularly if you'd had psychotherapeutic training, when you were listening to patients, your head popped into your head all these perhaps historical connections and ways of formulating it, and a model of a mother and child and all sorts of stuff, and oh, wait a minute, we've got to think in the transference and so on. So, and he just tried to describe in his paper how you had to put this to one side to really arrive at what was the unconscious communication. Now, do you disagree with that?
No, I don't. I agree with it completely, but I would argue further that, and I think Bion's wrong about being able to empty your mind. I think Richard said the same thing, actually. That I think it's a contradiction in terms, because I think that's what minds are. You can't empty your mind because,
you can discard a received
you've got
idea.
it, and
you can avoid the obvious. You can choose.
yes, that's a different level. That's a different level. But if you're talking about an unconscious, being unconsciously available to another person, then I'd say what you're doing is you're not doing what the semiotic interpretation, which Jung talks about here, and you're actually making yourself available to a symbolic process which involves unconscious theories, and that those unconscious theories are the collective. They are the things that we interpret the world with, and we interpret it through the collective, which is embedded, instantiated in our language.
Is that right? But that's different from an archetype.
I think you're partly talking about preconceptions, collective preconceptions, and individual and personal preconceptions. And one of the tasks or jobs or even enjoyments of being an analyst is constantly trying to monitor preconceptions which are earlier than theories. You said something about theories not long ago, and I found myself disagreeing totally. You said we all have theories, or I can't just quote you that. But I would suggest that you're partly talking about preconceptions, which we've got to try and monitor at the same time as listening to the patient. Listening either without a theory or without a preconception.
Without
or
a preconception.
Recognising what our preconception is.
With what Michael called the sort of the file drawer of interpretations that you
yes,
pull out.
Models of the psyche and various approaches and so on and so forth. But a lot of this kind of work that you're describing can, I think, be done in the minutiae of a very detailed supervision. And sometimes what is very enjoyable with a trainee is to go into a great deal of detail about only perhaps 5 minutes of the session, in which you really can examine the sort of thing you're talking about, I think. But not extensively, it's more in-depth, I would suggest.
But when you talk about one beginning to have theories about other people or about you, when you open your eyes in the first place, you're not talking about the kind of theories that James and Michael are talking about at all, are you? You're talking. You're talking at a completely different level.
Yes. Quite.
And I don't think James sort of
grasp.
understands what you're talking about.
Well,
Thank you very much, Joe.
I'm trying to actually turn it around the other way, because if you take Jung seriously, Jung said the collective comes first. And the individual, if he's lucky, sometimes manages to individuate from a collective and to become conscious of something. Now, that is what Jung was about. And I think that the seriousness of what Jung said was that actually individual minds don't make up collectives. Collectives may produce individual minds to a greater or lesser extent, but that mind is not a possession of an individual person. It's embedded in this deeper, connected, collective area. That is what Jung said, and it, in some ways, I think it's as daring as everybody says.
But isn't that one
Jung's thinking, Freud's thinking was about, the
Well-
sexual, what's it, of the unconscious.
But isn't that the one thing he said, like you're saying, that languages are common pool of understandings
And when I say language, I'm using it not in a sort
in a
of
broad sense.
very,
Right.
yeah.
But then on the other side of that, he had an area where there wasn't language, where there was the archetypes.
Well, you see, I mean, I think there's some ways of thinking about that, but I think that when Jung was thinking about the archetypes and the collective unconscious, he was still operating in the 19th century model of science and entities and so on. And what he did was he saw these collective things and he saw how they were happening, that they were happening, but he didn't have a way of thinking about how they might be happening. So he made them into things which you have in your genetic makeup, as it was understood by him at the time. And I think we have to basically give that idea up.
Ah, that's the point. I think this is where I disagree with you. I think this is where that crucial sentence you talk about, the semiotic interpretation, that means of symptoms, is it? So.
I think he's talking about kinds of interpretation, two different models of interpretation.
But when he says, when in short, he says it becomes meaningless. The semiotic interpretation becomes meaningless when it's applied exclusively and schematically.
Mm-hmm.
When in short, it ignores the real embodied, in brackets, nature of the symbol and debases it into a mere sign.
Mm-hmm.
Now what does he mean there when he says embodied?
Well, I open it up to you. I have some ideas about it, but let's think about it.
Well, I mean, is embodied? I get the sense that embodied is something to do, in your terms, with our common language, in the wider sense. Which I agree, it is something to do with it, but it's only partially, because there's another aspect of oneself, which I believe is the archetypal realm, which one doesn't share. In fact, we all have it, but one feels terribly alone in that area. And the language and the bridge and the kind of net of communality that language supports us with, that fails.
So would you say that it was what you're talking about is the biological basis for archaeology? Yeah. Right. For which there's increasing research evidence coming up in all sorts of things, not least of all the evidence for hardwiring for language, that if children aren't exposed to language before adolescence, they don't pick it up afterwards, as a for instance. Yeah.
The attributes.
Yeah.
You see
Talk
this-
to me about the terms that we're using. Correct my conscious, not as entities, but as processes and inclinations and propensities, rather than as theories and conceptions, etc., come afterwards. It is the process and the inclination and the propensity, and then theories, conceptions, entities, etc. But the ultimate is not the entity or the preconception.
Mm.
I must say I'm struggling a bit, but what I'm doing is thinking about patterns. And if we change some of the words that we've been using into patterns, if we have preconceptions which are innate patterns, perhaps we could agree that we share innate patterns which become more and more refined and become sophisticated patterns which we could call theories, and that we all have gradations of patterns, and when we interact with some, a pattern actually emerges out of an interaction with another person. And language surely is putting patterns into shared patterns into words. We see a bus and we teach a child that is the pattern that goes into our brains as a bus becomes the word bus, and so on and so forth. That if we started talking about patterns, we might get out of this dilemma.
That's the key.
See, my fear is that there's a sort of what would I fear that there's a sense in which perhaps it's because I don't understand what you're saying, but if I do, then my fear is that there's a kind of danger of enchantment that a method will provide us with a way of defeating the goddess. A method will mean that we'll devise a method where we won't be in fear and trembling at what may emerge from the unconscious.
Well, it's not mine. It's what I think. I think what I'm saying is that to be, and Jung is probably the only founding person in the field of psychology who actually did any empirical work. Nobody else did. And there's a history, a noble tradition in history there, which I think we needn't devalue or
beyond it,
not take seriously. Beyond it.
Well, he gave up his early researches into word association tests because he was a romantic. He wasn't. And then he was, as you
It's
say,
not what he
a
thought
rationalist
he was
positivist.
doing. It's not what he thought he was doing, and he said it over and over again.
When he was doing those experiments, he was trying to get evidence for the unconscious, and that was what drove him.
If you read through Jung, at every stage along the line, he says, my interest, my whole desire is the empirical study of the manifestations of the psyche, and look at all these places where we see them. That's what Jung was saying.
Yeah. Well,
That's what he was saying and showing.
so what does that prove?
Well, I think that, there's a culture of debunking empirical study, but I think that Jung would not have wanted that, and I think he was sincerely empirically motivated throughout his whole career.
I'm totally puzzled by your statement that there's a debunking of empirical research. I mean,
Yes.
Fonagy, for instance, who is the Freud Memorial Professor at the moment, is publishing all the time empirical research into psychoanalysis.
No, I just meant in the sort of within some of the Jungian tradition, there's a sort of feeling that, you know, if you do empirical study, that you're somehow taking away the sort of depth of meaning and so on. It's a tendency in some Jungian thought, contemporary Jungian thought. That's what I'm addressing.
But it didn't happen in Zurich when he was there, did it? Well, I know.
What?
Empirical research.
I don't know. I think Jung was a bit of a trickster, as we all know, and he did do things which weren't exactly empirical research, but it was what he wanted, and I think it's in the spirit of Jung to go on with it.
He was working with, the people who followed him, people who stood at his feet, weren't encouraged to do empirical research.
I think there's a danger of some very rhetorical thing going on here, which is that there's an appeal going on in various quarters to the authority of Jung. You know, as though that's kind of going to solve the problem. And actually, because I think one of the things that you've been saying, you've been saying, George, well, he's an empiricist. Other people saying, well, was he an empiricist? Was he doing empirical work? But I think another thing that you did was you said, well, look, he was on the button here, but he wasn't on the button there. You know, that he
as indeed was Freud, not on the button in some areas.
But of course, that does, you know, then it doesn't really matter whether he's an empiricist or not, because, you know, similarly, you know, we were saying, you've redefined the view of the archetype, haven't you? And I think this is a very central thing.
I'm raising a question about how one might think about it. That's all. And
but then what you said, well, you know, the area in which he was still wedded to 19th century ways of thought was that he thought the archetype was in some way genetic, and that seemed to be a way of saying, well, you know, Jung is the authority, but in this area he was 19th century, which means he's out of date, which means he's wrong. You know, I mean, he may have been 19th century, and he may have been right. He may have been 17th century and been right.
Well, I mean, if you're prepared to fund research into finding archetypes and on the double helix in terms of A, B's and C's, I think somebody's trying to do that sort of, that sort of research. But I think it's got its uses. Lang is doing research on, you know, the sort of neuroscientific research on a kind of systems model of language related to, you know, what happens in the cells of the brain and so on. And it's a possible, and, you know, not necessarily, and, you know, I support any kind of inquiry. Yeah. But all I'm saying, and the whole point of my paper is to say that I feel that in so many ways that as Jungians what we do is we try to say we're just as good as psychoanalysis, and, you know, and we try to sort of go around the edges of, you know, our theory and sort of show that it really is just as good as psychoanalysis. And all I'm saying is that if you go back to where Jung was at and take some of the very great differences in what he was proposing and take them seriously, and if you follow the line of thinking that's developed from where he was at then, you find yourself in a very rich area full of ideas about some of these problems, and we can make use of them. And there are ways of thinking about this archetype business.
But the way of thinking about the archetype business, it seems to me to be quite crucial. I mean, I'm not necessarily wedded to the genetic idea, but I think the crucial point is whether the archetype is purely social. Because I think you refer to this, this just above the Hermeneutics quote. I thought that your representation of Jung's hypothesis, 1, 2 and 3, actually was redefining Jung, where you said, particularly the development of the image into a lifelong process from the shared domain of cultural images, which she's embedded through participation in the basic processes of the social. Now, I mean, that seems to me to be a reformulation of what Jung was saying, where I think what Jung was saying was that it was through the social, through the myths and beliefs and institutions, that you saw evidence for something which was in itself not social. Now, my problem with it, in the end, is not whether it's genetic or not, but to do with the experience of the archetype. Because it's the key kind of quality of archetypal experience, it seems to me, and again this is about process and meaning and feeling, is this business about being gripped and fascination, and the way it seems to constellate meaning. When you meet something that feels archetypal, it feels kind of immediately meaningful and true. It may not be true, it may be a delusion. It seems to carry that quality that Jung called fascination. Now I find it very difficult to understand how a very powerful emotional quality like that can arise out of social meaning, the discovery of a meaning which is in origin social. And that's where it seems to me to be embedded or embodied in some kind of deeper layer of psychic experience. And actually I think that's what Jung was saying. The location of the archetype for Jung wasn't the social, it was the psychic. The psychic for Jung was always prior to the social.
Well, but you see, I take exception from you there, and I think this is where, in a sense, it's like the whole business about theory, which you drew your attention to, that the social, as you're reading it, is like the theory, any of the theories we might use sort of to think about things. When I'm talking about the social, I'm actually talking, and this is part of this sort of body of knowledge and theory, is that actually the mind does not exist without the social, in this sense that it is as social beings that we have minds. Minds emerged phylogenetically from social being, and they still do ontogenetically. Sorry?
And vice versa.
And
Social
vice
being
versa.
emerged from mind, from the development of mind.
Well, what I found, you see, in doing this research, is that when you actually start looking across this problem falls away, because you can actually see that there's a constant. I mean, it's hard to describe. You actually have to see how it works, but it's the same thing that we find in analysis, that subjective and objective become actually, they're not important. That actually you've got this interacting process. And I mean, in terms of researching the collective, to go back to that bit where I started, long before this, I'm still doing, that, and lots of other people are doing some work on this, and there's, stuff's being written and people are doing things, which is looking at how context, how a meaningful context is created by people when they're actually talking to each other and doing things together. And that you can't say that one came first, that they're happening together all the time. And if you take one away, the other one fails.
So if you were to do research on this field that you're talking about, where do you think it might take you? And I know you don't want us to ask questions apart from how, perhaps, but I was thinking about where as well.
Where?
Where do you think it might go?
Well, I'm just proposing some questions, and one of them is, could we find out more about archetypes if we took it as a model of, there is this phenomenon, and And we started to ask a question: could we find out how it works? Could we see how archetypes are drawn upon and how they appear and what happens when people are in them, which the only way we can find out about that is by what people say and do and how they act in relation to them. I mean, what happens? For example, maybe an archetype is something that happens in a field, not something that happens in some entity, in some individual's mind. And I think that's what Jung really meant.
Well, I think the difficulty, I mean, I agree entirely that people aren't don't come into the world and as 2 days old have a little cinema going on inside their head that shows Grimm's fairy tales in all kinds of detail. But though, and you can analyse the Grimm's fairy tales, I think, the actual images in terms that you can say. But I feel unless there's some kind of propensity that precedes all of this, that I'm probably only echoing what Warren's saying, but somehow or other, what you're saying doesn't seem to be convincing about how much passion there is in it all.
Mm-hmm.
And the state that one falls into with passions.
But I'm asking you where these passions are. I mean, to me, I have passions in relation to you all. I don't have them. That's where I have them. When I'm having passions, I'm thinking about you all. And I have different kinds of relationships with you all. And that's where my passions are. They happen there. They don't happen. They're not sort of suspended somewhere in individuals. They happen because we're here together.
But they don't just happen in language analysis.
So,
you sometimes with the patient, you sort of step into the lift and there's no lift there, and boom, when you go to the bottom of the lift shaft.
they don't just happen in psychoanalysis or analytical psychology either. It's just a way of thinking about them or finding out more about them. I'm not proposing a panacea. Repeat that. You caught me in it.
Yeah, but there's this concern we have that somewhere I don't know why, but the sense of somewhere the body is getting rid of. Somewhere there's a body being got rid of. And I keep feeling.
Yes, I agree with that. There's very little body. And there's little real feeling. It's all theories. It's all very intellectual. And the words, what words mean, and we've thrown out a lot of words and then throw back at us. Like empirical research, where's it stop and where does it start? You somewhere talk about measuring time and connectedness. Well, I don't quite know how one measures things like time or connectedness or correctness of an interpretation. One can measure. I don't know if measure is again a particular term we don't often use, I suppose, and it's very difficult. But you use it in connection with correctness, for instance. And I feel very much that, as you say, there's no body somewhere.
Well, actually, when I said that, I was criticizing that view of interpretation. I mean, I actually think it's a nod on that view of interpretation. I mean, about the body, well...
you see, when you talk about seeing, when one first sees, immediately there's a theory. What about the actual sensation? What are the actual look of people? Or then the feeling? You said you don't know where your feelings are. You say they are true in us. They are in you as well.
They happen between us.
Yeah, and in us, both.
Yes. But they happen in us because we are in relation.
Well,
if we're not in relation, they don't happen to us.
No, well, they're suspended on a net, where you're dependent on this, totally on this network. That suspends one to an extent, at times, above real connectedness to your actual body and feelings inside. Now, I know that you say, well, the inside is the same as the network, but I think they're different. I think the social collective is different from the archetypal collective.
I wonder how
And
many
Jung thought so too.
sorry, I wonder how many situations there are. I imagine there may be many where people sit and talk about the kind of experiences that are going on within them whilst they are making the interpretation or before they're making the interpretation. The experiences that are going on physically, people are talking about bodily, psychically, intellectually, emotionally, through sense of smell, all this kind of thing, to actually dare to intimately reveal all the different sensations that are going on in different parts of your body, body psyche, and actually talk about those experiences. And it's very, you talk about daring, and it is very scary to sit and reveal that kind of level, but it's that kind of level which is the key point of the interpretation and of making of the work, I feel.
Well, I mean, I think that's the way we do it now. It wasn't the way it was done even up to 15 or 20 years ago. And so we've got to remember that that's really quite a recent idea. That
Sure.
One.
Perhaps not for you.
It just makes me think of Jung's, I mean, if you're pushing aside all of Jung's dream series, where he
I'm not pushing aside anything. I'm welcoming us to think about all of it very seriously.
Yes, but there is a room full of people who are really puzzled, and there are one or two people, and Joe has spoken in this regard, who know something that the rest of us don't know, or have understood something that the rest of us don't understand, which we haven't yet been able really to get into a shape that the rest of us can understand. And Rosemary suggested that it's because it's so abstract and because it's so theoretical and because it's so intellectual that we're more used to thinking into experience rather than thinking away into abstraction. Now, is there a way in which you can think us into experience which can give those of us who are still in our bodies in a perhaps very literal way can resonate with your argument?
Well, I mean, I feel that in a way this is the kind of language with which we make the important work we do completely incomprehensible to everyone else in the world. That would be what I'd say.
It's working both ways, isn't it?
But there's a sort of sense in which somehow the way you're talking to us or not letting yourself talk to us makes it almost impossible to understand. I really hardly know what's being talked about. I feel I could understand if somebody would say it.
Well, I think what I'm saying to you is I'm not offering you a sort of blueprint of anything. I'm suggesting that there are some new ideas around and about. The whole point of new ideas is not that you know the answers. You start with them to find out new things.
The only new idea you've given us is that when a patient changes the subject, you tell the patient they've changed the subject. Well, that doesn't strike most of us as a new idea.
James, that's a bit...
No, I'm being very hard
Yeah.
because
It's a bit
I'm
hard,
wanting to... it is a bit hard, but
I
I'm
think
wanting
what
to
we're
really
lacking
try and
is the
nail it
next
down to
paper.
interaction.
It's George's next paper that perhaps we need.
It isn't my next
Goes
paper, it's quite a few papers away, because I think that, we need a rethink.
Is there something relatively simple that we need to get hold of, which is that that an archetype is an idea? It doesn't exist, but archetypal experiences exist, archetypal fantasies, archetypal so-and-so. We all know that really it's adjectival, and which means something is being done or being experienced.
It's a
rather than
quality.
noun.
It's a quality
And you're
of
trying
things.
to get, I'm not quite sure whether you're trying to get away from reifying, or if you're trying to take us towards reifying. That's one of the things that puzzles me.
What I'm
But
trying to
I'm
say
sorry to
is-
remind everybody of this incredibly simple thing, that an archetype in itself doesn't exist.
That's what I'm saying.
I like
It's a quality of things.
Subject to correction, I like to make a statement about the archetype, and let's see if this makes sense. As far as I understand, it is the universal psychological tendencies of the human species compared to biological instincts, like the sexual instinct or instinct for eating, hunger, etc. Simply the instinctual drive, the psychological end of it, the universal.
I'm disagreeing with it, I'm afraid.
You?
I disagree with that.
That's exactly what Jung says, as far as my reading goes. And do you have any compulsive reasoning to say that Jung was wrong?
I'm just saying that I disagree and that I think with that...
Well, I would rather prefer to go by Jung than your
and that
socialized theories about it.
Something...
Archetype is not an interactive, socialistic or social sciences thing. It is a psychological instinct according to Jung, and this makes very good sense to me, just as there are biological instincts.
Can I pick up what Judith is saying? I've forgotten the words exactly, but we know it's not a thing that you can picture in your hands and so on. And I'm just wondering about if the struggle is trying to make language do too much. That language comes down, from above down, and what we're also struggling with is what comes from the bottom up. And it's that, how do they sort of run into each other? That point where sort of meaning somehow semi-magically arises, or something happens inside us that life takes that vital shape or whatever. And that we interpret with words, but we also, something else goes on, which doesn't happen with words, which is what I was trying to get into about the dream series, where, or I'm not sure if that's a particular, but when one's sitting with people, all sorts of things are going on inside us, and we're aware of them and can have thoughts about them, but we don't say anything about them. But if we believe you, and that's what you're saying, this is going on, Joe says we each have our space, we each have our own field, but they somehow communicate, but in a way where we don't actually use words, we don't know, and I'm not sure how, apart from being able to get into the mind like, thinking about mind like Edelman's been talking about, where you get, it's the pattern of excitation in the brain at one particular level when an event comes in, and how they interact and the patterns that they lay down, and how value, he doesn't make it, he's left the issue of how value actually comes into being. He imports value somehow, but in that, out of that, value comes in.
Yeah. Well, I think that, is it time?
No, it's not quite time yet. I just look. We only have about 7 minutes. I wonder. You can see that we are extremely puzzled and confused. And I wondered if you could help us towards sort of ending this meeting.
I don't think it's fair to keep asking Georgia to end it and explain it, actually, because I think quite a lot of
well, she's
quite a lot
written
of
the
what
paper.
she's said is very theoretical, but also lost. I mean, part of the discussion has lost the relational part of it, which you've also emphasised a lot, and I suppose that answers some of your question, which is that the social context in which it is happening can be looked at not just in terms of words and language, but could also be looked at as pattern, as you said, as looking at the silences and the empty spaces and the uncomfortable feelings, if we could find a way to talk to each other about them. And I feel that somehow the relationship aspect of it, which may well involve bodies, is also what George is talking about. It isn't just verbal and high theory ideas. I feel something very sort of paradoxical has gone on suddenly with me this evening, in that you've given us a lot of words and a lot of mind, but I personally have felt quite disturbed, which reaches me in my body. And so in some ways I feel actually that you've been extremely mercurial
was what I intended to be.
You start off
And
with
that's very difficult to measure.
you start off with a quotation from James Joyce and asked us to sort of play with that. The paper seemed to me crystal clear. I mean, it was a very clear exposition of good reasons for refraining from imputing meaning at a relatively early stage.
That's one way of thinking.
James Joyce was arguing for that. I mean, speaking of the cost of imputing meaning at an early stage. I suppose
quite
a
simple.
bit later on
Really?
in literature, what I feel has been going on this evening is rather like in your refusal repeatedly to impute meaning, to give meaning, and to reply to questions directly. It's put us rather into the sort of atmosphere of a Samuel Beckett play, where, or a surrealist piece of art, where meaning is deliberately being withheld, so that something can happen. And that is, I agree, a very disturbing experience.
And that's what Joyce does.
What did you say?
That's what Joyce does, actually.
But George, go on, tell us about, I mean, I understand what you're saying, but how can you bring this into the consulting room? Well, I think that...
For the minute, I'm perfectly happy to stay outside the consulting room and say that we have a responsibility to our patients to think about what we're doing. And we sometimes have to step outside the consulting room to do that. And I think I'm really getting wound up now that there's a big defence that goes on in this society, which is that, and it makes me think of the defence of women who won't leave the kitchen. You know, that, you know, it is very comfortable and domestic in our consulting rooms. And what we have is good enough to be getting on with, and we do more or less good enough work. But, you know, from strictly practical point of view, psychotherapy and analysis are under extreme attack at the moment. And I mean, just from a pragmatic point of view, and just from an intellectual point of view, I feel that, you know, asking questions about our basic assumptions is, we're required to do it. And, you know, we've got to analyse our analysis.
But I don't think anybody is trying to prevent us from that. And I think your generalisations, they sound a bit peculiar. You know, that we're not always comfortable in our consulting rooms, and we do often think about what analysis is at the weekend, for example.
No, I'm not saying that we're comfortable in our consulting rooms. Of course, it's very uncomfortable a lot of time, but it is a place where we know how to manage.
And a lot of the time we're in the consulting room, we don't understand the meaning of what's going on, which is why I wanted to bring
about all
George
of us from your experience of
I
your
think
work.
I would just like to say that, you know, I brought in both Fred Plaut's book and Carla Stranger's book, which I hope everybody will have a look at, because it's a very good book. And, you know, these are issues that we need to think about, which is, you know, what is the basis of our theory? And we need to go on thinking about it.
But I
And that's
feel
all I'm saying.
presenting us here as something that I don't recognize. I don't recognize us being against research or against an empirical approach as well as looking for symbols and the symbolic meaning. I don't see us as avoiding confrontations with theoreticians or other disciplines. I mean, I don't recognize myself in that which you attribute to us. I can see the dangers you point out, and they are very necessary. And for the danger of reifying, I think it's very important. Very often it's a laziness of language. It takes two words to say an archetype.
I agree, it's a laziness of language, and it's
but
everywhere.
I think we all are aware of the danger of reifying and the necessity to remain as near to the ground as possible. And that the ground sometimes is experience, and it may be physical, or as and you notice you didn't hear Avril talking about her body experience. She experiences a lot through her body, and she uses her body.
Well,
and you didn't actually hear it even.
There's a very nice article which I would suggest that people might like to look at it's a book by Mary Douglas called Natural Symbols, which you probably know. And there's an article in there by her called The Two Bodies, which is really good. I recommend it to you.
Well,
There's also a book by her called Purity and Danger,
Yes.
which I think has been quite a theme this evening.
I'm going to draw this.
Thank you.
Meeting to a close. I think Georgie has let the genie out of the bottle, and we must all deal with it the best we can. Thank you very much. Thank you.